Let us come back for the last talk in this session. And this is a talk by Laurel Brehm and Kathryn Bock on separating lexical and structural contributions to number agreement.
I'm coming from all the way across the quad in the psych department. I think I'm the only representative of the psych department in this year's program, but so be it. They're all missing out. This is work I've done with my advisor, Bock. The thing that I'm particularly interested in is the kind of mistakes people make when they're talking. The kind of mistake I'm going to be talking about today is something called attraction. It's something that commonly happens in subject-verb agreement production in particular. I will direct your attention to a really nice example of an utterance that exemplifies attraction coming from late-night TV. Conan O'Brien is doing a dance like he often does on television, and he rips his pants while he's doing this dance. And he says, "The back of my pants are falling off." This utterance is an example of attraction. In this case, he should have said, "The back of my pants is falling off." Right? Because back is the controller of agreement in this situation. Instead, he says, "The back of my pants are falling off." What's going on here is you've got this local noun pants, which is grammatically plural, and that induces a spurious agreement pattern. So the big thing that I'm interested in is, one, whether all kinds of variations of this sort are actually an error. I want to know the contribution of conceptual factors, in particular notional number, which I'll get into a little bit later. As well, I'm interested in the kind of mechanism that drives these type of variations, whether it's predominantly lexical mechanism or predominantly structural mechanism. So framing this in terms of the utterance I just presented, did Conan make his error because of the grammatically plural local noun pants, or because of the part-whole relationship in the subject-noun phrase, "the back of my pants"? Okay, I'm going to start by talking about lexical aspects of agreement. Under a framework like this, agreement is basically a correlation between number features. Singular nouns are often followed by singular verbs. Plural nouns are often followed by plural verbs, and these correlations drive agreement phenomena. So what's really important for this kind of account is the kind of co-occurrences that happen between words. So what I've got here are a couple of really common lexical variations. On the left, you probably can't see this super well. This is the bottom of a White Castle hamburger box. It's a picture a friend sent to me. It says, "Double hamburger is one of those English words that are plural in form yet treated as singular, like pants or scissors." This isn't quite right, but I appreciate that fast food joints are interested in linguistics. That's pretty cool. So what they're trying to get at is that you get these variations in agreement from irregular words. So pluralia tantum, such as scissors or pants, they are... So that means if you only have one pair of scissors or one pair of pants, you're still going to use a plural verb with it. Kind of the opposite of that is something like mass nouns, like pasta or butter. No matter how much pasta, no matter how much butter you have, it's still going to be treated as singular. Another really common type of lexical variation I've got on the right here, this is a photo from an airport in the UK. It says, "This unit is out of service due to a mechanical component failure. Manchester Airport apologize for any inconvenience." So this is an example of a phenomenon, it's a dialect difference between American and British English. So in American English, collective nouns are treated as singular. In British English, they're often treated as plural. So in this case, Manchester Airport is being used as a collective here. If this sign was in the US, it would be apologizes rather than apologize. Another important type of lexical variation, this is something I'll be getting into today, these are variations due to lexical semantics. So the idea is that relationships between words can increase the activation of this local noun, which can increase the error rate. So for example, you can give people a task that says, "I'd like you to make a passive sentence with these materials, the album by the classical composers. Please also use this other word," or praised. So if you give people the word played to use in their sentence, it's nice because it matches very well with the head noun and less well with the local noun. So albums are highly likely to be played, more likely than composers are. In contrast, praised, both albums and composers can be praised with equal certainty. So what happens here is that because the predicate doesn't match the local noun on the left with played, you don't get very many plural verbs that are produced, and people are pretty fast in a comprehension task. In contrast, with praised, the predicate does match the local noun. People produce a lot more plural verbs, and they're slower in an analogous comprehension task, showing that these relationships between the words can increase difficulty. Moving on to structural aspects of agreement. In this kind of framework, agreement is based upon whole phrases. It's not just about words, it's about the entire subject phrase. So what's really important for this framework that's not important for a lexical framework is the relationship between the reference. In particular, one relationship I'm very interested in is something called notional number. This is the idea of how many things are in the phrase. So I've got a couple of sentence subjects here. The phone with the missing buttons compared to the phone with the broken toasters. The same noun is the controller of agreement in both cases, phone, but the semantic relationship between the nouns and the phrase is a little bit different between the two, and this is something that really matters for this kind of account of agreement, and I'll get into it. One really nice place to see these structural variations in agreement is for conjoined noun phrases. So here's a picture of my sister and best friend and me. My sister's in the orange shirt. This conjoined noun phrase actually is ambiguous. So most of the time, such a conjoined noun phrase would refer to two people. So I could say my sister and best friend like to travel. This is a picture of us on vacation together. In this case, the subject noun phrase is being treated as plural. The verb is being treated as plural. However, I could be referring to two roles played by one person. In this case, my sister is also my best friend, and I can use that productively in agreement. I can say my sister and best friend likes to travel, in which case there's no ambiguity. You understand what I'm talking about. So this is notional agreement. The subject noun phrase doesn't change at all, but the verb does. Another example of structural kind of variation in agreement is going back to this idea of the phone with the missing button, the phone with the broken toaster. This is something I'll term referential coherence. So what's going on here is that the linkage between the nouns inside the sentence, so phone and buttons, phone and toasters, is different. The semantic relationship is different. So the phone with the missing buttons is inherently an utterance about one thing. It's a phone that has a particular property. We'll term this strongly coherent. In contrast, the phone with the broken toasters is an utterance about more than one thing. And because of that relationship, we'll call it weakly coherent. So one thing, more than one thing. What's important is that the phone is the subject of the sentence in both cases. So it should be the same number. It's the same thing. They're both singular. But you're sort of thinking about more than one thing in this case on the right. This affects agreement rates. So on the left here, the phone with the missing button. Not very many plural verbs that are elicited here, and people are pretty fast in their productions. On the right, where it's weakly coherent, this notional number does affect agreement. There's a lot more plural verbs that are produced, and people are pretty slow in their productions of correct agreement. All right, so far I've given you a whirlwind overview of evidence for use of both lexical and structural factors in agreement. What I want to turn to now is determining the extent to which they're both necessary. We're going to test this experimentally. So I've got a photorealistic drawing of Conan here, making his speech error. The idea is that the back of my pants are falling off, could come from a lexical source. Plural nouns are usually followed by plural verbs. Or it could come from a structural source. There's sort of these sources of plurality in the structure and the message that it represents. All right, so in experiment 1, I'm going to be eliciting singular verb agreement. We're going to have people complete complex noun phrases that have singular heads, like the phone with the broken toasters. You'll see that again and again. We're going to manipulate some lexical and some structural variables that go into it, and we're going to measure both the speed and the accuracy of completions. This is nice because it gives us a measure of performance, even in the cases where people get it right. So we don't have the sparse data problem that is often very problematic. So the three factors we're going to be looking at here, I've already mentioned thus far in the talk. Referential coherence, so how many things are in the message? Is it one thing or more than one thing? This is a structural factor. Predicate bias, how are the words related to each other? Do you have a predicate that is closely matched to the head noun or the local noun? This is a lexical factor. It has to do with the lexical semantic links between words. And then local noun number, which people have theorized is both a structural and a lexical factor. The question is, which one does it matter more for? So here are some examples of our stimuli. We've got a fully crossed 2x2x2 design. So we've got phrases that are, so these are sentence fragments that people are going to complete. They have strong coherence, like the phone with a missing button. They have weak coherence, like the phone with a broken toaster. We manipulate the local noun number. The last noun varies between singular and plural, so phone with the missing button, phone with the missing buttons, toaster, toasters, so on and so forth. And we manipulate the predicate that we ask people to use to complete the sentence, like the task I showed you a couple slides back. So they're either given a predicate that matches really well with the head, like ringing. Phones are extremely likely to be ringing, more so than buttons or toasters are. So the other level of this is a local bias. property. So in this case, buttons are more likely to be plastic than phones are, but phones can still be plastic, crucially, so the sentence still makes sense. Toasters are more likely to be shiny than phones are, phones could still be shiny. So this local bias is really sort of how much does it connect with that local noun. What we predict, fairly straightforward here for main effects. If referential coherence matters, that's going to be a structural factor. Something that's weakly coherent, something that describes more than one thing, is going to be hard for producing singular agreement. For predicate bias, if you've got a local biasing predicate, it's going to activate this local noun. That'll be harder for producing agreement that matches with the head noun. And local noun number, this local plural for producing singular agreement, it's going to be harder for either lexical or structural reasons. What allows us to equivocate between those two is the interaction effect. If we see that local noun number interacts with our structural variable, it's probably doing something structural. If it interacts with our lexical variable, it's probably doing something lexical. The task that we're using is a preamble completion paradigm. We have the instruction, please complete these sentence fragments as quickly and as accurately as possible. We collect data from a whole lot of people, and we measure the speed and the accuracy of their responses. So what the task looks like, you get a cue to look at the screen, you get a predicate to remember, you hear a sentence fragment, so in this case they see ringing, they hear the phone with the missing button, they get a cue to respond, and at that cue, they produce an ending to the sentence. So they say something like, was ringing. And we measure how long it takes them to initiate the response and what kind of verb they use inside it. So we've got two dependent measures here, speed and accuracy. What's important is that they're not independent of each other. We think they reflect the same kinds of processes. So we're going to use a single statistical framework to look at them together. This is something called a diffusion model. It's been used a lot in cognitive psychology. The important thing is that it removes all kinds of variability due to individual differences and outputs just one single index of general difficulty in the thing that we care about, which is agreement. So that's cool. So here I'm plotting that general measure of difficulty. For this parameter, a bigger number is a better number. That's a faster, more accurate decision in this case, agreement decision. On the lines, on the plot, I've got the local noun number. So yellow is local singular, and blue is local plural. On the left, I've got strongly coherent fragments, like the phone with a missing button. On the right, I've got weakly coherent fragments, like the phone with a broken toaster. Then nested within that, I've got the predicate bias. So the head biasing predicate, like ringing, is on the left. And the local biasing predicate like plastic or shiny is on the right. So the big thing we see here is an effective local noun number. This is good. It's grammatical number agreement. Grammatical number probably should matter. What we see is that the local singulars are easy, no matter what else is going on. And the local plurals are harder depending on the other factors. One of these other factors is referential coherence. So the phone with the broken toasters is harder than the phone with the broken toasters is harder than the phone with the missing buttons. And this is only the case in the local plural line. So this one's flat and this one slopes down. So this allows us to see that these kinds of structural, notionally based effects do matter, but only when there's other sources of structural difficulty, such as the local plural noun. We also see an interaction between local noun number and predicate bias, although it is marginal. So the phone with the missing buttons was plastic. So this guy here is harder than the phone with the missing buttons was ringing. Also, in this case too, shiny is harder than ringing. So that suggests, again, that these lexical semantic effects also matter. And again, they also matter only to the extent that local noun number is there, so only via attraction. So what we see from experiment 1 is that grammatical number is the most important factor for grammatical number agreement. However, these structural notional effects do matter when you've got conflict in the local noun. And the lexical semantic effects matter too. But the magnitude of this effect is a bit smaller. So this suggests that though local noun number has both structural and lexical contributions, structure might matter a little bit more. So we're going to follow this up with a second experiment. We'll look at how well this generalizes. In this case, we're going to be looking at plural agreement for conjoined noun phrases, which I seeded you with the idea of back at the beginning. So conjoined noun phrases are nice because they're prescriptively plural, but they have flexibility based upon notional number. So for example, my sister and best friend lives in New York. So that's something that works based upon the roles being assigned. It also works for abstract reference. So life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is the American ideal. These abstract kind of reference can much more easily be singular. So this is work coming out of our department by Heidi Lormer. So another property of conjoined noun phrases is that inherently they're kind of pairs of nouns. So we can adapt some of the lexical access literature and look at these lexical effects of word pairs. So if I ask you to alternate between reading words and naming pictures, this one is going to be easier than that one. So saying whale and then naming this picture, which is a shark, that's going to be harder than saying mop and naming this picture, which is also shark, because on the left you've got high level of semantic relatedness between whale and shark. All right, so these are the things we're going to use for experiment 2. So it's pretty similar to experiment 1, except people are producing plural agreement. They're completing conjoined noun phrases. The first noun is always going to be singular. We'll vary the second noun. We're manipulating some lexical and some structural variables here. Again, we're going to measure the speed and the accuracy of people's completions. So our factors here are abstraction, which is a structural factor. How many things are in this phrase? Something that's abstract is less individuated and more singular. Something that's concrete is more individuated and more plural. The elements within it. We'll look at lexical semantic relatedness, so how are these words connected to each other, what's the meaning relationship for them, and we'll look at local noun number, which once again we're predicting could be lexical, could be structural. The stimuli look like this. We've got phrases like the dish and the plate, which are concrete. We've got phrases like the hypothesis and the theory, which are abstract. We'll keep the head noun the same always, and we'll vary the local noun. Well, always within an item anyway. So you'll have the dish and the plate, which are highly related to each other. You'll have the dish and the cat, which are less highly related. Hypothesis and theory versus hypothesis and thought. And then we'll also manipulate the number on that last noun such that it's sometimes singular and sometimes plural. So our predictions are pretty similar to experiment 1. Abstraction is a structural factor. We're predicting that if you've got something that's abstract, it's going to be more notionally singular. It'll be harder to produce plural agreement. Lexical semantic relatedness, you've got something that's related, that's going to drive competition, that's going to be harder. So the related ones will be harder than the unrelated ones. And again, we've got this local noun number effect. We can equivocate by looking at the interaction between that and the other two factors. If it interacts with our structural factor, it's probably having a structural effect. If it interacts with our lexical factor, it's probably having a lexical effect. So the method's basically the same as experiment 1. We're not giving people predicates to use here. We've had them pick out of a set of adjectives we had them memorize at the beginning. These are good, bad, ready, and true. We asked them to pick the one that they think works the best for the sentence at hand, collected data from a whole bunch of people, and did the same analysis techniques, this diffusion model, combining speed and accuracy together. So what I'm plotting here is our general measure of difficulty from this model. Again, a bigger number is a better number. That's a faster and more accurate decision. Again, I've got local noun number split by the lines here. So local plural is the blue triangles. Local singulars, the yellow down here. Circles, I guess. I've got concrete phrases on the left, so things like dish and plate, dish and cat. I've got abstract phrases on the right, things like hypothesis and theory, hypothesis and thought. Then nested within that, I've got the related and unrelated local noun. So once again, we see a big effect of local noun number. So in this case, local plural is easier than local singular when you're producing a plural verb. That's a nice little replication here. So that suggests that for this local noun, what's easiest is the verb congruent local number. So plural is easier when you're producing plural. Singular is easier when you're producing singular. We see nested within that a smaller effect of abstraction, such that the concrete things on the left here are easier than the abstract things. And there's a marginal interaction between local noun number and abstraction, suggesting that once again, this kind of notional, structural, message level information matters, and it particularly matters when you've got other sources of structural difficulty. And we see no significant effects of relatedness here. So the dish and the plate is equally hard to the dish and the cat, suggesting that for this type of thing, this lexical semantic factor doesn't matter. All right, so for experiment 2, conclusions, we're seeing again that grammatical number is the thing that matters the most, even when we're producing a plural verb. That's a pretty gimme kind of conclusion, but it's nice to see that replicated. Again, we're seeing that these structural and notional effects do matter, and they matter more so when there's other sources of structural difficulty in the phrase. So if you've got incongruent notional number and grammatical number, that's pretty hard. And for this experiment, we don't see any effect of our lexical semantic variable. This may be due to properties of noun-noun versus noun-verb relationships, particularly for subject-verb number agreement. There are good reasons to think those might be a little different. All right, to sum up, I've shown you two studies here that show that agreement calls on both structural and lexical information. What is structurally easy is something that's referentially cohesive, something that's concrete, and when notional and grammatical number match each other. What is lexically easy is when that local noun and the verb number match each other, and when you've got a predicate that you're going to use that's compatible with the head of the phrase. So what's structurally easy is sort of top-down information. What's lexically easy is looking ahead information. It seems to be that these factors are used separately. They don't interact with each other. This leads us to proposing a model that's based on structure building followed by lexical retrieval. Another thing that's interesting here that I'm starting to look at now is that this suggests that for agreement production, there's a greater role for structural than lexical information, and it may be backwards in comprehension. Comprehension may call more on lexical than structural information. This is something that Darren Tanner and I have been talking about looking at next year. So just to close, I started with late night talk. I'll end with late night talk. I think the layman's view, a lot of people care about the rules for correct speech. This is a quote from The Daily Show. Grammar, it's the rules what make your mouth feel dumb. But studying these kinds of errors tells us a lot about how the mind uses language. And in fact, I'd like to argue that some of them aren't errors at all. I think this notional agreement is just a variation rather than an error. And that means that any kind of model of agreement and syntax in general does need to be able to account for these kinds of natural variations people produce. Thanks.
For questions?
Interesting talk. In your first experiment, the predicates, in one case you were eliciting participles.
Yeah.
I presume they're a whole lot easier than the
Yes.
adjectives.
Yep.
Right.
Yes, that is correct. And that kind of ties into this idea of what kind of plausibility information, what kind of lexical interference effects you're going to see for agreement. And this is a big difference between our study and the Thornton and McDonald stuff. So yeah, that's an important difference that definitely matters. Yeah. So I guess the question at hand for that is whether it's just pure word co-occurrences that are important. So you're tracking that this thing goes with that thing, or something that's a little bit more fine-grained, maybe labeled. So it's this part of speech and this part of speech going together. And I think it's that one. I think that's the thing that matters.
Going back to the first one, so when you did did you actually try to distinguish complement PPs from adjunct PPs? Because I think the with the plurality one, that's almost a commutative. That's like a coordinate structure.
Yep.
But
were you my reviewer number 2 for that paper? Yep. Yes, that is another important difference between them. The relationship is an attributive versus is it like part whole versus go back. Yeah. So yes, there is this kind of so the phone with the missing button is yeah. So that is an important difference. We actually looked at this with a few different types of structures in an earlier experiment. So we looked at these with phrases. We also looked at comparing for and of. So the picture of the flowers versus the picture with the flowers, that sort of doesn't, again, get at it quite in the same way. We've also looked at the differences between relative clauses and prepositional phrases, again, sort of skirting around this issue that the actual syntactic relationship isn't really the same within them. So, and that's something that might matter. I'm not sure what the literature is on this in other languages. I think if you're in another language, a lot of times you look at gender agreement instead. So, for example, in Russian, I think there is that commutative case in that. So I don't know what the results are from that, but I would gather someone's probably looked at it, and I think it is another thing that matters.
I was going to make a similar comment insofar as there's a fair amount of typological evidence of relationship between and expressions and with expressions, commutative expressions, and also of crossover between these.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the comment. Yeah, there's some interesting work on this lexical interference paradigm, comparing in Japanese the various, I don't speak Japanese, I don't remember exactly what it is, but various different kinds of it's basically getting at this idea of conjunctions versus comitative kind of relationship. So it looks like, yeah, that's going to be a thing that matters as well here. It's something we need to pay attention to.
Sorry, my throat. So in addition to the lexical and structural factor shaping agreement, do you think there is a room to allow, I mean, a cognitive explanation for this in terms of cognitive loud, how does it shape agreement? I think if you have a similar sentence, like you have a question, I mean, like is, I'm sure that the same participant who said the back of the pants are, if you have an interrogative, he would say is the back of the pants. So here, so he opts for the singular because it is easier to process in terms of cognitive.
Yeah, these kinds of memory constraints are really interesting for agreement, and people have mostly looked at this in terms of comprehension. I know there's at least one study that's looked at, there's actually a fair amount of studies that have looked at the difference between these kinds of questions versus declarative sentences, and they're usually framed in a slightly different way in terms of their hierarchical structure, but that might be something worth going back to. I'm starting a new experiment now with Erica Hussey, who's a postdoc in our department, looking at memory constraints in comprehension. So.
This is very interesting. I wonder if there's any way to build kind of the intended meaning into the methodology. So I'm thinking, so Russian is another language which has commutative constructions, and there, depending on the meaning, the agreement actually may have to be plural. So if it's the phone with the toaster and it's clear that they're doing something together, it's much easier to get for animates, of course, right? The dog with the cat were fighting. You have to use the plural. It's certainly not an error. In fact, using the singular would be an error. So I guess, you know, when you're in this experimental setup, you can't really tell if people are producing a plural. Is it because they actually think that the phone and the toaster are both shiny? Right. That would be suggest more of a grammatical phenomena versus just being kind of led astray by toasters being plural. Is there any way that you could test that? Have you thought about testing
Yes, I have thought about this, not quite in those terms, but yeah, the kind of message that people are coming up with, we assume something about it, but we don't know exactly. So I'm looking at this now by giving people pictures. So you have, I'm planting a message in their head a little bit more tightly. So for example, you could look at, you have little objects moving on the screen, so these two go together versus this one, and this one's just kind of background information. So yeah, I think that that's another interesting thing to look at. It's kind of a direction I'm hoping to move in the future. So yeah.
Other questions? Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks.